Hello there, Compass. Greetings from online, and we are going to dive right into our next message in our series called More Than Doing. And one of the things that I think Christians maybe struggle to do or practice, but we would consider it a spiritual discipline, is this thing called fasting. And what is fasting? So let's read what Jesus says, Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 16 through 18. He says, "When you fast, don't make it obvious as the hypocrites do, for they try to look miserable or disheveled so people will admire them for their fasting. I tell you the truth, that is the only reward they will ever get. But when you fast, comb your hair, wash your face, and then no one will notice that you're fasting except your Father who knows what you do in private, and your Father who sees everything will reward you." You know, we've been talking in this whole series about spiritual disciplines and how they don't make it so that God will love us. They don't make it so that we will be saved or get to go to heaven one day. We do these things, we practice these disciplines so that we can experience more of God in our lives, so that we can live like the people that God already sees us as being. And when we think about it, that's kind of like training, right? And there's a really big difference between training to be godly versus trying to be godly. And I want to explain that a little bit. I think for a lot of people who follow Jesus, maybe a lot of people have gone to church, maybe you grew up in a church where they taught you that you needed to try really, really hard to not break the rules, try really, really hard to imitate Jesus, try really, really hard to live a good and precise life, and then maybe you'll be good enough, to get into heaven, good enough for God to love you, good enough to get, a pin on your chest, for all this effort that you're putting forth. But trying really hard doesn't make us good at something. If I wanted to go out and run a marathon, I could go try tomorrow really hard to run a marathon. But I'm not going to be very good at that because I haven't put any time in to training myself for running a marathon. Right? That takes benchmarks and milestones that I want to achieve to, get off the couch, and they have these things, get off, from the couch to 5K, from the couch to 10K, and ultimately from the couch to marathon, where you incrementally add a little bit of effort along the way, and you get better and stronger. You build your muscles and your endurance, and you're better able to perform. Uh, and that, in some ways, is how we want to look at spiritual disciplines, including the spiritual discipline of fasting. See, these things are training that help us experience more of God in our lives. And and specifically, I want to quote John Mark Comer here. He says that spiritual disciplines are training, not trying. You practice them not to prove your devotion. You practice them to become the kind of person who can live with God. And so, fasting, whether that's abstaining from food or that's cutting ourselves off from some of the noise in the world, maybe taking a break from some activity that we enjoy or that takes a lot of our time, or maybe it's just withdrawing and having some solitude, which some would say is its own spiritual practice. But I think prayer and fasting and solitude all kind of work together. Um, and and the way I've framed this and what we decided we wanted to title this message um, is warrior monks, right? We're people of the book. We're people who pray. We're intercessors, but but today's message is called Warrior Monks. And there's a reason why I chose that title, because fasting and solitude sounds kind of wimpy, right? It sounds like something that only weak people might do, or someone who's too passive, uh, too much of a pacifist to take on spiritual battles. And so we're just going to sort of bury our heads in the sand. We're just going to kind of withdraw from the world. But that's not what fasting and solitude are. In fact, there are centuries of Christians who have gone before us, many different groups of people who embody this warrior monk mentality. See, we think of monks as people who dress up in special robes, or live in caves or in monasteries, up on some high mountaintop, withdrawn from the rest of the world. But we think of warriors as those who go out and confront danger, who take on the enemy, who get bloodied in battle, and they are aggressive. And we never really think of these two things as similar, but by describing God's people, and there have been numerous groups of people throughout the history of Christianity who maybe have embodied this title of warrior monk. They're taking both sides, right? They're being with God and getting their strength from their relationship with God, and at the same time, they're engaged in the spiritual fight that's all around them. They're not giving up, they're not giving in, they're not yielding territory, and yet their strength and their power comes from the time that they spend with God, not from aggression or their effort. And so, going back to this passage where Jesus teaches about fasting, I want us to look at it through the lens of, hey, Jesus isn't telling us to be passive, weak, submissive kind of people when it comes to spiritual warfare. On the contrary, he's inviting every follower of his to take something that he assumed they were already going to be doing, which we'll look at in a second, and use it as fuel to fight, right? As power to fight back against our enemy. So I just want to break this passage down a little bit. Jesus begins by saying, when you fast, right? Jesus just assumes that his followers would fast. They would take time away from certain things. Now, the Pharisees, the really religious people living at the time of Jesus, they had very rigid rules about fasting. And for them, it really pretty much was about food. There were 2 days a week that they would fast. The Old Testament really only commanded a fast very occasionally. And some scholars would say just once a year. The Pharisees kind of elevated that and said, well, we're going to be really spiritual. We're going to not eat for 2 different days of the week. And so the idea was in culture that if you were really religious, you'd take a couple days off from eating. And but the Pharisees would take it a little further than that. They would make a big deal about how hungry they were and how weak, that they were, because somehow that was demonstrating their faith and their devotion to God. And what Jesus is saying is, listen, when you fast, I want you to do it differently than the hypocrites do, than the religious leaders. Dallas Willard, who's an authority on spiritual discipline, says, grace is not opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning. Fasting is effort, but it's not for earning anything, right? The things that we do to draw near to God and to experience more of God is not because we're trying to earn his love or his favor, but rather we're putting effort in so that we can do more with God and that he can do more in and through us. And so, carrying in this analogy that we're warrior monks, look, every army trains, every army has to practice, and every athlete has disciplines and skills that they have to develop even when they're not in a game. And the analogy holds true that even Christians, every Christian really is training and developing our spiritual muscles for the fight that we're in. Somebody said disciplines don't get us into God's presence; they wake us up to the presence of God that we're already in. And so Jesus says, when you fast, don't look somber like the hypocrites do, right? Don't make a big performance out of your spirituality, right? And so Jesus isn't criticizing fasting. He's criticizing maybe the way people had begun to do it. That fasting is not about self-punishment. It's not about inflicting yourself with pain and discomfort because somehow that makes you more worthy of God's love. And it's certainly not about getting other people to be impressed by what you're doing. Richard Foster, another authority on spiritual disciplines, he wrote that fasting reveals what controls us, right? Hunger doesn't weaken us, it exposes our attachments. Man, this is really profound. And if you can get this, I think you're going to see fasting in a very different light, right? Hunger, like, so if we're fasting from food, when we get hungry, it's not making us weak in that time of fasting. Instead, it's exposing what our appetite is, what our desire is. When we fast, it makes us honest about the things that we normally go to for our strength and our hope and our energy and our joy. And it reveals the things that we have grown dependent on instead of God, the things that we lean on instead of getting our strength and our power from our relationship with Jesus. And so fasting reveals what we are dependent on. Sometimes that's comfort, right? Sometimes that's our routine, our the things that we enjoy the most, right? And if that's where our strength is coming from, then taking a break from one of those things will reveal that to us, right? Creating a hunger for that thing that we would normally go to for strength reveals to us just how important that thing has become, and that sometimes it's taking God's place in our hearts, right? So fasting has a way of revealing our addictions, whether that's to comfort or distraction, right? So many of us spend so much time doing things just as an escape from reality, right? We watch TV, we listen to music, we zone out in movies or books. We get in the endless rabbit trail of YouTube videos and reels and Instagram feed posts, and it's like, man, how much time do I devote to that, and why? Why is it so addictive, right? Because it's an escape. It's giving me a break from the stresses of reality, and it's giving me time to maybe avoid something I really ought to be dealing with. And so it's exposing these coping mechanisms that we've allowed ourselves to fortify when we choose deliberately to fast. And fasting sort of begins to break that spell. It breaks the spell of consumption. It helps us to now engage in the spiritual fight in a way that we weren't expecting to, right? Our spiritual enemy rarely attacks us head on. Usually it's coming from the things that we didn't expect. So the tactics of our enemy is not to necessarily hit us in the forehead. Instead, it's to distract us, to numb us, to keep us full on sort of spiritual junk food so that we don't have much hunger for God. And in doing that, ironically, that's what makes us passive. When we withdraw from those things that we consume, when we take time in God's word, when we're taking time in solitude, when we're fasting from some aspect of our physical lives, that is what gives us power to be able to fight our spiritual battles. So giving up things. Um, and we're going to define a little bit more about where we can start with that, with what fasting is. But sometimes we stop considering this as a possible discipline for us, and I think the reason why it's such an unpopular and under practiced discipline is because we think I don't want to have to give something up. I mean, doesn't every good gift come from God, right? And the book of James tells us it does. um, it doesn't Paul say to Timothy in 1 Timothy 3:16 that God has blessed us with all kinds of material blessings for our enjoyment. Why do I need to give something up in order to experience more of God? And and, and I think it's important just to understand that no, this is spiritual training, right? It's not giving something up because we're making ourselves martyrs. We're giving something up so that we can experience more of God, but we can become aware of the weaknesses we have to our enemy. We become aware of the things that we've grown dependent on besides God. But the irony here is that you and I give stuff up all the time, right? We give up our sleep when we're worried and stressed out about things. Like, ever have one of those restless nights where you just can't fall asleep because your mind won't stop racing? Stress makes us give up our rest, and we give up our peace, right? When we spend our days worrying and fretting and trying to plan and plot how to overcome some difficulty that we're experiencing, whether it's something going wrong with our health or one of our relationships. We give up our finances, right? Because we will spend and spend looking for the relief that comes from buying the things that we think we want and need. And we'll give up the discipline of having a budget because we want the freedom of just going and doing whatever we want to do. And yet what ends up happening is we give up money, we give up this tool, this resource that we need to be able to survive. And then that lack of money causes us to worry and have stress. We give up time with our kids because we have to work so much. We give up time with church because we have commitments that we've made for ball teams and gym memberships. We give up our health because, man, going through the drive-through and getting that crappy food, we think it's a time saver. We think it's going to be happy. I mean, it isn't called a happy meal, right? And yet it's robbing us of our health. So we give up things all the time. I guess the question is, will we choose what we give up so that we can get what we really want? Somebody said, you don't know what owns you until you try to live without it. What if instead of life sort of stealing our joy and stealing our rest and stealing our peace and stealing time with our family and stealing our faith and stealing our health, what if we decide what we want to give up? We strategically pick the things that we're going to do without for a period of time so that we can learn the discipline of depending on God. And fasting is giving something up in our lives so that we can focus what we would have given our attention, our devotion, our allegiance to, and instead we're going to give our attention, our devotion, our allegiance to God during that time when I'm craving that thing I'm giving up. So whether it's giving up eating or it's giving up being around other people, like solitude, when we do that, it moves us from trying to perform for God, perform for other people, and instead it draws us near to spending time and being with God. Jesus continues to go on this thing. He said, no, listen, don't be like the hypocrites that make a big religious performance out of this. Instead, you put oil on your head, you wash your face. What's he saying? Get ready for the day. Go live your life. Go be a part of whatever you would have done. Make this a hidden practice. This is something that we're not doing for applause. We're not doing it to manage other people's images, or to try to manage our image to other people. We're just trying to be in God's presence. Pete Greig says prayer in solitude is frontline resistance, not retreat. Right? Frontline resistance, not retreat. In other words, when we choose to spend a day in silence, when we choose to turn off social media for a period of time, that's not retreat. That's not disengagement. Instead, that's an intentional time of alignment, of putting ourselves in alignment with God, right? We're not withdrawing because we're retreating from the fight. Instead, it's a strategy where we're equipping ourselves for the fight. And I believe that because the Bible describes that Jesus often withdrew before he had a major ministry moment. He went away, for 40 days into the wilderness after his baptism before he really started doing a lot of public teaching. And during that time, as he's away and he's preparing and he's fasting, I believe God was empowering him for the ministry ahead. But it was also really important immediately because it was during that time that he was tested by the enemy. He was also tempted during that time. But I believe Jesus was able to overcome that temptation because he had been preparing himself with time alone with God. He had learned and been forcing himself to practice depending on God rather than bread, rather than applause, rather than having friends and family nearby. He was all alone out in the desert, was hungry. And what were the things that the devil tempted him with? He tempted him with, hey, you turn this rock into bread. And Jesus was able to resist that hunger because he was disciplining himself to know that he depended on God more than he depended on food. And so he was able to resist that temptation to take God's place when it wasn't appropriate for him to do so. And the devil tried to tempt him with giving him all the kingdoms of mankind. Everybody will worship you. And he's like, I'm not going to force that. God is going to see to it that every knee will bow and every tongue confess. And so I'm not going to take a shortcut here. So Jesus was able to withstand that temptation and fight back spiritually because he had prepared himself. Solitude, withdrawing, and prayer, and these are the things that Jesus would do when he was fasting. This is a way that Christians fight our battles, right? This is the way that we're empowered to stand up to the enemy's schemes, and whether that's coming from temptation to sin or temptation to despair and lose hope, to live in a state of numbness or apathy or depression and not to fight back, right? That's what the enemy wants, is for us to be ineffective as followers of Jesus. But over and over again, we see that fasting, ironically, is kind of the source of spiritual power. The disciples tried to drive out a demon from a young boy one time, and in Mark chapter 9, the Bible tells us they came to Jesus and said, hey, why weren't we able to cast out this demon? And we were unsuccessful in doing that. And Jesus says to them, hey, some demons can only be driven out by prayer and fasting. Now, it's interesting. Jesus had given them power to heal people, to drive out demons, to make blind people be able to see. But for whatever reason, that alone didn't work in this situation. And what Jesus was reminding them is that, listen, your power doesn't just come from your skill or your ability or even the giftedness that I've given you. It comes from dependence on God. And prayer and fasting is a way that we demonstrate, hey, we're depending on God for this, not just our giftedness. Right? So whether you're tempted to solve all your own issues and your own problems, our command from Jesus is no, get your power from God, and we refuel that power, recharge that power by getting away with God, being alone with God, resisting or giving up something that we're normally dependent on, even if it's just temporarily, so that we remind and train ourselves that our strength comes from God. There were all kinds of other reasons and occasions. In the book of Acts, we find that the early Christians often prayed and fasted when it came time to appoint leaders. And so in Acts chapter 13 and 14, for example, we see the early Christian leaders in the church there praying and fasting and laying their hands on Paul and Barnabas and sending them out. And then in chapter 14, Paul and Barnabas are appointing new elders in churches, right? They're planting new churches and they're appointing leaders to be in place and to take care of the church while they go on and plant more churches and continue to travel. And and those important decisions of choosing leaders, deciding who's going to care spiritually for the church, who's going to be, local. And I would extend this today when we think about church staff and putting somebody in a volunteer role. That's really important, right? We're often tempted to just say, hey, we like that person. They're a cool guy. That lady really does a good job, and let's just put them in charge of some ministry. Let's give them a title. But the reality is that this is important work, and if we're going to make a wise choice, we're going to pray and fast. But what else might that extend to? If you're a business owner, do you pray and fast about the staff you choose to hire? You pray and fast about important decisions that you need to make, whether you're choosing a spouse or a career, or you're trying to guide and have a hard conversation with one of your children. Man, when we try to go forth and do these things in our own effort and our own strength and our own giftedness, we're overlooking the opportunity to be empowered by God, right? And all of these things are small battles, sometimes little skirmishes in the war that we're fighting spiritually with our enemy. We might win more of these if we would take the time to empower ourselves with fasting. The early Celtic Christians, these Celtic monks, they stated over and over again that when they would withdraw from the world around them, that it wasn't an escape, but it was so that they could spend time with God and re-enter the world with clarity and with courage. What is it that's troubling you? What is it you wish you understood better? What decision have you been fretting about? What situation seems impossible? Are we just trying to push through and stand up in those circumstances with our own ability, or are we seeking to be filled and fueled by the Spirit of God? Fasting is a really big part of how people did this in the Bible, and so I think it's a really big part of what we as followers of Jesus are to be doing. Jesus said, when you do this, when you fast, and you're not like the hypocrites, and you're doing this in secret, your Father in heaven will see what you're doing, and he will reward you. And remember, the reward is not salvation. The reward is not God's love. He already loves you. You're saved by the grace of Jesus because of what Jesus has already done for you. Rob Dreher argues that Christians don't need to withdraw from culture, right? But we have to form resilient inner lives, or else the culture will start forming us. And so we're these warrior monks where we're engaging in the fight, but at the same time, we recognize that our fuel and our power comes from being with God. And so we're practicing these disciplines in private so that we can live more like Jesus in public. And so our reward is not the applause we get from people or some kind of bragging rights. The reward is not so that God will like us more. No, the reward is clarity about how I'm supposed to live. The reward is the ability to withstand and overcome temptation. The reward is strength when I'm feeling pressured or put down. It's peace when it seems like there's chaos all around me. The reward is a deeper relationship with God. And So the reality is that the battles that we're going to win, whether they're the battles we face with our own temptation, or they're the battles we face with other people, or clashing with culture, or the pressures that we feel, these outcomes will be determined, the victory will be determined based on how we invest that time privately. And so Jesus invites us to fast. He assumes we'll do it because we need that fuel for the fight. And so we need to talk just in some practical terms as we wrap up what that looks like. Um, Fasting is not living in caves or in a monastery. Fasting is not abandoning your family or your responsibilities. Um, Fasting is not trying to perform for other people. But here's what it could be for you: it could be a routine of abstaining from something like food. Maybe it's half day or a whole day where you don't eat any food, you just have water, or you abstain from a whole category of foods. Um, Daniel in the Old Testament abstained from any meat. He just had water and vegetables. And a lot of people use that in a practical way and say, "Oh, this is a good diet, like for your health, and this will help you lose weight and everything." Well, maybe it will. Surely, being a vegetarian for a period of time and only having water, for a lot of us, that would be a really big improvement on the typical American diet, and we probably would lose a lot of weight. Um, and there's popular stuff out there called like the Daniel fast, and people basically spiritualize that, and they say, hey, this isn't just about losing weight, this is about drawing near to God. And it's like, okay, you're almost there. um, but I think that the point of fasting and doing this regularly is to train ourselves to be dependent on God. Maybe it's not food at all, maybe it's social media, maybe it's limiting or cutting out altogether your connection with other people online, so that you can spend the time you would have doing that connecting with God, maybe reading the Bible, prayer. Maybe it's intentionally pursuing face-to-face conversations and having relational time with the people most important to you, rather than being distracted and let's face it, a lot of us addicted to the attention that we get from media. Maybe it's just noise in general, and we just never sit in quiet. And this is where solitude really becomes a big deal. I remember in 2018, one of the first extended periods of time I ever spent in solitude. And I've been a Christian for years, but I was invited while I was on a retreat to go take 3 hours up on a mountainside to just be alone with God. And they really didn't give us a whole lot of other instructions of how we were going to use our time. I was armed with a pen and some paper, and just some comfortable clothes to kind of find a spot hiking up this hill, this mountainside, where I could get alone with God. And then what am I going to do with 3 hours all by myself? But those 3 hours were very meaningful, because it showed me that when I turn the volume down on everything else, and I don't have any other agenda or reminders or meetings or appointments, and I just have some time, and I'm not choosing to watch TV or play music, I'm not choosing to take a nap, although that can be a worthwhile venture. But this was going to be specifically time in solitude with God. Man, it's hard to explain. But as a Christian, I had never really devoted time to that. And when I did, I really experienced listening to God and speaking my heart in a way that I had never really done before. So, how do we do this? Maybe you start by skipping one meal in a week, and during that time that you would have spent on your meal, you pray instead. Or maybe it's every day you're gonna have 15 minutes of just total silence, and this can be any point in the day. It doesn't have to be first thing. Maybe it's 1 hour of silence every week, that you schedule, that you set an appointment for yourself, that you're not going to be disturbed from. Nobody else can claim that time, but you need that hour because you need time to refuel and recharge. Maybe it's one day a month where you decide you're going to be unplugged from any electronics, right? Anything that's not, lighting or heat or something that helps you cook food, right? You're going to turn off all the noise of television, radio, and all that. Maybe it's a season of your life where you cancel your subscriptions to social media or to streaming services. But the point is that you and I don't drift into spiritual strength. We don't drift into spiritual depth. We have to train for that, right? And this isn't to make God love you more. He loves you deeply. It's to experience him more in our everyday lives. Listen, Jesus fasted. He often withdrew to lonely places. He fought battles in an unseen arena so that he could ultimately thrive and do the things God had called him to do. And if Jesus needed to do that, and he's the Son of God, we absolutely need that. We need that refueling time. John Mark Comer again says that the goal of spiritual practices is not a more religious life, but a life increasingly available to God. And so I think as you think about giving something up, letting go of something that we have a tight grasp on earth, it's giving us the opportunity to take hold of something that God has for us. It's giving us the opportunity to get deeper in our walk with him. You can keep fighting your battles on your own, but Jesus invites us. In fact, he assumes we will be empowered by him and our relationship with God, so that when we fight those battles, we'll win. God bless you today as you guys are at home or maybe watching online later. Take some time and decide what's one way this week that I can begin to fast, that I can begin to disconnect from something that really has a hold of my attention. What's a way that I can practice letting go of the things on earth so that I can grab hold of the life that Jesus has for me? God bless you.